And welcome back to another Catalyst Talks. I am Joseph Kopser with Nora Anderson of Gray Line, and I'm really excited about today's topic. We're talking about the book Chain Reaction, looking at how blockchain will have a positive and lasting impact on the developing world. I'm joined today by its four co-authors, Brandon, Gavin, John, and Paul. First of all, I want to compliment you on writing a book about blockchain that's not only easy to understand, but more importantly, in its application and well beyond just the finance side of it. So to all four of you, kudos. But this is a short form interview and there's four of you. So I want to get into this quick. I want to remind viewers, we're live right now on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. If you have questions about blockchain or its application in the developing world, drop them into the different chats. We'll bring some of your questions up on screen live. Hope to get to everybody. But Paul, we're going to start with you. And the way you wrote the book, just for people who haven't bought it yet on Amazon, which I hope they do, it's really interactive. I really did feel like I was in a conversation with you all, or actually watching a conversation with you all and reading alongside as you kind of dove into the differences. Thanks, Nora, for bringing up the Amazon link there for how to buy the book. So let's start with the most obvious question, Paul, which is, why did you write the book with so much literature out there about blockchain?
All right. Thank you very much. I think it's a great question, Joseph. So on the one hand, you've got lots of literature out there about blockchain, but a lot of it's really deep into the technicalities. You know, how does this technology work? What might it do in the future? At the time we started working on the book, I was head of research at Tellimer, an emerging market investment research network. And I kept meeting companies and individuals in emerging markets who were upset about about Bitcoin volatility because they were using it in their business to settle transactions across borders, or because there were capital controls, or they were concerned about their local currency being depreciated. They were looking at other blockchain technologies. So I realized very quickly that actually there was this whole conversation going on about blockchain as a technology, but there wasn't this whole conversation going on about blockchain as a use case. And we saw that first in emerging markets.
Yeah. Well, and thank you for setting that table. So Brandon, when you were in the early stages of the book, you did the difference, or explain the difference between Bitcoin with a capital B and Bitcoin with a little b. Kind of give the audience what that means with all these different cryptocurrencies that are out there and how it plays into the book.
Sure, good question. This is kind of a pet peeve of mine too. So you're kind of scratching an itch here. But so when you talk about this stuff, there's sort of two concepts. Well, three really. There's the technology, underlying technology. Then there's the sort of the system that gets built around the technology that enables the technology to live, breathe, survive, operate, and kind of exist. And then you have this concept of the token itself, in this case, Bitcoin. So when we use, in the book, when we use Bitcoin with the big B, we're talking about the system that is Bitcoin. This is the people, the software, the hardware, the energy, the money, all the bits that go into enabling the Bitcoin system to function and operate. When we use the small b, what we're talking about is the token, the sort of the asset that gets passed from one entity, one person, one organization to another as part of that transaction. And so we're trying to help differentiate the two, because I think, again, when you come at this, as many folks have, it's a big, broad, complex morass of stuff. And this is sort of one way we've tried to kind of break it down in a way to make it a little bit more consumable.
Yeah. So Gavin, this question is coming to you, and feel free to punt over to John. But when we posted this link and said, we're talking about chain reaction using cryptocurrencies and blockchain for developing countries, a friend of mine, Cassandra, already posted on LinkedIn, or in this case, Facebook, I think it was, who said, wait a minute, how can you talk about using a technology in parts of the world where many of them don't even have basic access to clean water and shoes, but you all lay out why it's so important in terms of doing that leap ahead or leapfrog technology. Go into that a little bit for the viewers on what you mean by that in the book.
Yeah, I think that's really encapsulates it well, that developing countries, because some of the institutions that we're accustomed to, whether it's energy or banks or real estate registration, some of those institutions in some countries, and you can't generalize too much, but in some countries those are really lacking. And what the leapfrog opportunity here is that emerging markets often don't have that legacy of having, let's say, a broad banking network across the country. They're not able to get to some of the more remote districts in a country. If it's real estate, you're sometimes you don't have the trust and the confidence in the land registry system. And what blockchain offers, the screaming opportunity for developing countries, is to take that technology on so that it can replicate what exists from existing institutions in the developed world. And really the mission for the book is for this to become part of the narrative from legislators in developing countries, from development finance institutions, from institutions like the World Bank, the IMF. If you're pushing for transparency in emerging markets, blockchain is one way to get to that point.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you highlighted the idea of the global aspect of this, or the World Bank and what they could be doing. So if you're viewing now live, or if you're viewing later on and you find this through whatever search that it comes to your computer or your TV, by all means, drop in the chat names of people that you know that work with the U.S. Agency for International Development, or that work in State Department, or whatever country of origin you're from. Because what I found to be so fascinating is these are some pretty complex technologies. There's a lot of people that are working around the world hard on this. But John, over to you, and feel free to punt to Paul if this question doesn't quite fit. But, when I was reading in the book about the notion that there have been forms of mobile payments before, or mobile money, well before blockchain was a concept. And so people have been using their phones quite a bit, but it was very, very clunky. However, for the unbanked and those without credit, it was the best thing that they had, especially in areas where corruption or crime prevented the easy use of cash. What does that look like to the viewer, John, in terms of trying to wrap their brain around how you're trying to go at these important issues to do that leap ahead, like Gavin was saying?
So I think good question. That sort of fits in with this narrative of where is the bar for technology adoption within a community. And I think what we've explored in the book is that in the developed world, where we have credit cards and debit cards and a plethora of online payment systems, the bar for us is relatively high. Whereas in the developing world, where your experience of mobile money might be limited to, say, M-Pesa or a local sort of domestic telephone network operating system, the possibility of international transfer that comes with using a cryptocurrency, becomes very, very appealing. And the technology that the crypto transaction is replacing isn't so good. So the bar is perhaps potentially a little bit lower. I know Paul probably has some strong views on that, because he had some really recent experience whilst we were writing the book of using those systems whilst he was in Africa.
Yeah, please. So for those who haven't picked up and bought the book yet, you'll learn inside the cover that Paul actually wrote a lot of this book literally walking across many of the countries with your family that you describe in the book. So jump into an anecdote, help illustrate this to the viewer, what you're talking about with the potential. Oh,
You're muted.
I'm muted.
No, Paul is.
Oh, Paul.
the perennial.
Okay.
The
Well, I lost everybody there.
I need to.
Oh, you're on mute.
I've got to learn this before the end of 2021. I thought I'd get it in 2020. So, two quick things. One is I teach MBA students all over the world. If I go back 5 or even 10 years, in most emerging markets, you say, when did you last pay for something with your phone? And most people would put up their hands. Even a couple of years ago, when Apple Pay had been out for a while, people in London or in New York or in Texas, indeed, would never have thought about paying with their phone. They have all these existing systems, credit cards, et cetera, that are expensive, that are clunky, that involve complex settlement, but they were there. So the bar for paying with your phone was really high, and the technology had to be really good. By contrast, in Africa, even if it's clunky and you're texting complicated codes, it's still worth doing. So I'll just tell one anecdote, and it actually isn't in the book, but it's a great example of every piece of where blockchain ought to touch this. At the end of the trip, as Joseph mentioned, I spent 6 months with my family and my school-age kids traveling from Cape Town to Kigali while writing this. And we were on our way back from Kigali to Uganda, and the bus broke down, so we couldn't get a bus, so I needed a vehicle. And I'm at the border with Rwanda, and you get dropped off, and then you have to wait to get picked up by someone else. And it's pouring with rain, and this guy drives up in a 4x4, and I start chatting to him about my problem. And he says, well, actually, this is a rental car. I'm driving it to Kampala, which is 2 days away. Why don't you take it? So, I come up with a big wad of cash. We sign a little piece of paper. He has no idea who I am. I have no idea who he is. Getting the cash was quite complicated. I give him the money. I get the car. Off I go. In the US or in Europe, we would have had a credit check. We would have had a credit card. We would have had a proper contract. That's just not possible in most of the developing world. So if we had had a simple blockchain-based system to register that contract, a simple blockchain-based system to make a large payment between two people from different countries, which we didn't have, absolutely it would have been better than a bit of paper and a big wad of cash standing in the rain on the Uganda-Rwanda border.
Yeah, and I correct me if I'm wrong, Paul. Was it you that was involved in the book, in the story about how you were trying to pay in a country that did not, I think it was in China, that only accepted WeChat and cash, and you had to go to 25 different vendors to pay with a credit card?
That was me.
That was you.
The unfortunate person without any enough cash for the meal. Yeah, so I tried to use my credit cards, which had a couple of the main ones, and no acceptance there. And it just and the helpful server took me to various different places down the street to try to get the payment via WeChat, and it just hit home to me then. This was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, but it hit home to me then how China was so much more advanced than we were at that point on using mobile wallets. And as you probably know, WeChat is a lot more than mobile payments. It's it's a whole ecosystem that's developed around that, and it makes sense that China would have adopted that technology before the US, before much of Europe, for exactly the reasons that Paul was just outlining.
Yeah. Well, both you and Paul just built on this idea of trust. And by the way, for those of you who are watching live, if you have any specific questions for this group of experts, by all means, drop them in the chat right now live. If you're watching later on, reach out to them or buy their book. But let's talk about this idea. And this is a toss-up question to any of the four of you. This is a question about this notion of trust. And I get people all the time as I listen to different commentary on blockchain and what it means right now for this ledger. And people are saying, well, I just don't trust it. And yet they trust money as we know it today. And kind of the humorous reality of it is all forms of currency going back to the beginning of time have been based on trust. So if any one of you want to kind of pick that up, explain why trust is an important component and what the thesis of your book does about creating trust and developing parts of the world that right now maybe lack it in certain institutions.
Yeah, let me jump in here. There's a word once you do start getting into this stuff that you'll hear among some of the zealots, if you will, in the community, and that is trustless. They claim that some of these systems, Bitcoin in particular, is a trustless system, which is in fact incorrect. And I think you bring it up well in your question. It's not about whether you're trusting or not trusting. It's about what you're trusting. And
by what you're trusting, go a little deeper into that.
Sure. Yeah. So I think, the reality is certainly in the developed world, we're very comfortable with trusting our government to a degree, trusting our banks, trusting our legal system, all of these mechanisms and mechanics that exist that allow for
you're trusting literally that little device that sits on the counter at the gas station at the restaurant. You trust that when you swipe your card and all your information, it's all fine.
Yeah. The reality is, though, number one, banks sometimes fall short in using that trust. There's a ton of feeding off that transaction. There's a lot of money or value that gets extracted by all of these intermediaries, when in fact there's technology now where things could be more efficient, more effective, where more of the value gets transferred between entity and entity and less of that value gets extracted from that transaction cost itself. And then the other side, again, the thesis of the book is that developing markets, that trust equation is much different, much more complex, much less efficient than it is in the developed world. And that's why, the thesis is that as these things mature, that sort of greenfield in the developing markets is going to be where this stuff is going to take root, because again, the trust is different. The governments are much less trusted. The currencies are very, very volatile. You think Bitcoin's volatile? Well, look at the, Zambia or Bolivia or Venezuela and their currency prices over recent months and years. So, so there's a lot of opportunity in those developing markets.
So another part that you go into in the book, and again, this is only a 30-minute discussion, so any one of you all can pop in at this point, but you talk about property rights and why it's so important to know who owns the property that is being sold to another property because of the 419 scams, which, maybe some people here are even familiar with, depending on how people have been involved with different transactions. So to any one of the four of you, talk about the notion of property rights and what blockchain is going to do for the developed world or developing world that you go into.
Well, I can jump in here. I mean, you rightly talk about the 419 scams. In Nigeria, if you visit there, as we talk about in the book, you'll see on houses this house is not for sale, and the reason is that a lot of the time what you get is people that don't own a property that will sell a property, and the same thing happens in other assets, and that's for the simple breakdown of Nigeria as an example. The same thing occurs in other countries where you just don't have the land registry that perhaps we're accustomed to in parts of Europe, in the US, and so that becomes possible. So how there's been various different blockchain initiatives that have attempted to create a registry on the blockchain. This is really difficult, but this is the pinnacle of what blockchain could achieve. So for example, there's an example of a system that's been created in Ghana where something like over 70% of property isn't properly registered. So the consequence of that is that if you're, let's say, a farmer and you're looking to get credit in order to buy seeds, to buy fertilizer, or to expand your smallholder business, it's very difficult to do that based on the collateral of your property, because the bank simply doesn't accept the proof that is yours. So land registry is one example. Another really important example of, going back to your previous question about trust, is medicine. And that, in a COVID context, that's hugely important. A double digits percentage of medicine in Africa is known to be fake. Hospitals themselves can't tell what the provenance of a lot of medicine that they use is.
And
and
you
so
even show, for viewers that don't own your book yet, you even show two side-by-side examples of medicine. One is fake, one is real. And to a layman like myself, they look exactly the same. So how would they know? Yeah,
that's exactly it. So please.
And I was just saying, it's important to bear in mind, in developing countries, people they often can't afford that entire packet. So you go to the pharmacy and you buy, cut out individual blister packs to say, 2 tablets. You have no idea where it's coming from. I mean, right. And in that kind of tremendously volatile, trustless situation, a blockchain-based solution doesn't need to be perfect to make things a whole lot better. Sorry, John.
No, I was just going to add, coming back to the technology, and I think something again that we do repeatedly in the book is, we often sort of compare everything to Bitcoin, because what we're saying is that, that problem around verification and who owns what money, Bitcoin does solve in a near perfect way. And then what we're saying through the case studies in the book is that, look, some of these other systems aren't perfect now, but they're probably worth talking about as potential solutions around verification and trust systems. And as they develop, they just might get better, and they might be sufficient to perform a useful function.
Yeah, and again, to the viewer who's not familiar with blockchain, you all do a fabulous job of pointing out, okay, hold on, folks. ARPANET, really kind of became its own thing in the 60s. We didn't even send our first email until 1989. And then from there, it was another 20 or so years before we had the likes of Google and Apple as we know them today. So give it some time, I think is what you're saying, John. But in the meantime, I want to talk about the different kinds of assets and how we look at it. In fact, one thing I thought was humorous in the way you described it is blockchain and the technologies enabled might allow a person to own a fractional 1/100 millionth of an aircraft, a modern day jet. So just for a moment, just talk about not just in the developing world, but for all economies, what is possible through the technologies.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, this stuff is software. And I think this is kind of where my background, I've worked in software for a long time. Once you digitize things, once you make things electronic and get away from the physicality, it unleashes a whole host of other ideas, other things you can do with it that in the analog world are not very feasible, or it's just too hard, not efficient enough. But once it becomes digitized, there's, again, the creativity abounds as far as what you can do. And the idea of digitizing a transaction and allowing a single transaction that today, again, in many systems requires many people, many steps, many procedures, many bits, physical and digital, and just allow all of that to kind of matriculate on its own. There's going to be a lot, I think, that comes from that.
Yeah.
That we're, anyone who tells you what it's going to be is lying because they don't know.
Yeah.
Nobody really knows what this will be, but it's going to be something interesting.
So there's a couple of real world examples of that we talk about. One is a stock exchange called Merge Exchange in the Seychelles, which has become the first stock exchange to issue tokenized securities. So what they did, for example, is a Ferrari that would be beyond the reach of most of us was split into 1 million pieces and sold. And you can then, it's not having the piece of the Ferrari that's important, but having the access to what is one of the best performing asset classes in the world and kind of democratizing that. Another example is art or even beats. If you got music producers that produce beats that will often be taken away from them, they won't see the royalties. You can take that onto the blockchain and
Yeah, well, so let's actually return to this notion of how it is being used for good. Viewer Kevin Berger there pointed out that he appreciated the fact that we're discussing how blockchain is more than just financial transaction. So let's talk about how it's used in voting around the world. And I got to give a little shout out, throw a little shade to my friends in New York City right now that are having trouble with their own voting systems. But let's talk about developing nations, though, in terms of what that could mean in terms of being able to use blockchain technologies.
This will be a good one because I don't think I agree.
Oh, but okay. Let's hear the discussion.
Well, I guess I'll set the counter example. So one of the things that really gets ignored in general within the Bitcoin and in the sort of crypto realm is the reality that there's two realities. One, that people are at the edges of these systems. So it's not just code. It always interfaces with people at some point. The other, though, is the onboarding of the digital, the physical to the digital. And so when it comes to voting, the blockchain technology, software, all of that's fine, but it really matters the process, procedure, system for how the vote or the person gets their action digitized. That sort of rub between the real world and the digital world. And that gets sort of ignored a lot in some of the Pollyannish, like, oh my gosh, blockchain will save the world kind of stuff. You got to really, focus on how that physical and digital interaction happens.
So, and again, Bitcoin sort of,
Sorry.
did that. Bitcoin has sort of done that in a perfect way, because I think what Brandon's really talking about there is how would you distribute the private keys that would enable people to register their artifact or their vote, within a blockchain system. And Bitcoin did that by providing people with an economic interest in the private keys that it distributed, and over time those private keys have had more, gained more and more value. To what extent would people protect that value or even value that item in a voting network? We don't know. We don't know.
But let me come in on that, because I think it's also a great example of why developing countries are the places to look for this technology. So let's say, Joseph, you gave the example of New York, right? Most of voting in New York happens offline. It's who's on the voter roll, how do we verify identification? The actual machine is not predominantly the issue, and the blockchain-based solution is only going to replace the machine. So in that sense, for New York, I completely agree with Brandon. If we think about Afghanistan, right, there is no voting roll. The only verification is they, put indelible ink on your finger and you vote, and you don't get to vote twice because they have the indelible ink. So in that system, actually the offline piece of voting is much, much simpler. And it's the actual tallying and maintenance of votes that's more challenging. So in those types of developing world contexts, blockchain can be good enough, because we're not going to have a perfect voter roll for Afghanistan, or indeed for any African country I've been to, or most developing countries I've been to. We're going to have something that works okay. And if we can use blockchain to inject some trust and digitize the part that really isn't dangerous in New York, we're not worried that those ballot boxes are being stuffed. But in Zambia or Afghanistan, I'm really worried. So, I've got a different problem to solve, and I don't need to worry about the first part to get to something that's good enough for Zambia or good enough for Afghanistan, but definitely not good enough for New York.
Yeah. Well, I think you guys have done an excellent job in the book of exploring the opportunities for especially developing countries using everything we've talked about, from currency, banking, property rights, voting, medicine. But let me turn back to what some of the critics would say, and you all do address it a little bit in the book, which is talk about the energy consumption associated with the way that the formula was designed from that white paper back in 2008, and what it's doing to data centers around the world for those that don't understand the mining techniques. Anybody want to take that on? We've only got literally 3 minutes left, but I'd love to kind of address that here.
As an aside to that question, I think it's the 12th of July. There's an association of Bitcoin miners globally that's going to publish for the first time some substantiated data around energy usage within the Bitcoin network, and actually the sources of energy consumption. Look, I think Brandon and I have spoken about this a few times between ourselves. We're relatively relaxed about the energy consumption because it's a feature of Bitcoin. There are many other blockchain networks that don't have energy intensive the protocols, the way that they're operated are not energy intensive in themselves, and those protocols, I guess, have weaknesses because of that fact.
Yeah.
So it's sort of it's something that is within the design of Bitcoin in particular.
Yeah, the big problem I have with this whole discussion around energy that's kind of happening in the Twitter sphere and elsewhere is the premise that looking at the energy consumption in absolute terms is just kind of unfair. Looking at what Bitcoin mining in particular uses from an energy consumption perspective, in order to make that relevant, you have to compare that to something similar, which would be, like, what is the banking infrastructure around the world? How much energy does that use across all the offices? And
everything from the tall skyscrapers to the movement of trucks and money and hard
currency. If you add all that up, that too would also equal, small country-sized energy consumption.
Fair enough. Well, we are approaching the end of the 30-minute time. I want to go around the horn and capture 1 point from each of the four of you for readers who have not yet picked up the book, but will shortly be picking it up. So we'll start with you, Paul, there we go, John, go ahead.
A point to wrap up. Please buy our book. If you think about blockchain, you think about technology, keep an open mind, because it's a story that's unfolding through time, and we don't know where it's going. So this is a book just about that asks more questions than provides answers.
Keep an open mind. I like it, Paul.
I'll build on that with one more. Keep it simple. lots of the examples that we've seen fail because they're overly complicated. They involve introducing unnecessary tokens. Think about what the problem is you're trying to solve. Think about whether your technology does it. Build something really simple and make it work. And those are the kinds of use cases that will succeed in emerging markets first and here later. Gavin,
thank you. Thank you, Paul. Gavin?
I would say think bigger than Bitcoin, and that's with a small b, because the blockchain aspect is so much wider. One of the most ambitious case studies that we talk about is how to get war criminals convicted by measuring evidence. That is the span of where blockchain can go potentially.
Absolutely. And Brandon? Take us home.
2 bits. One, be careful of the language. There's a lot of words used on this space where the people don't actually, there's a lot of nuance, a lot more gray. That's kind of the big thing. Then the next thing, I already said it. If anybody tells you they know what's going to happen, they're lying. They don't know. Nobody knows. But that's what makes it fun and makes it exciting to try and learn about it, because it's a constant, steep learning curve for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to thank the 4 of you and Nora for being a part of this as well, to help keep all this produced and moving smoothly with such a large group of co-authors. Again, the book is Chain Reaction: How Blockchain Will Transform the Developing World. It's a wonderful read. It's written in a much different style. If you read a lot of nonfiction or crunchy stuff, it's very conversational, and they break it down with analogies and anecdotes that are easy to understand. So, gentlemen, thanks for joining me. Nora, thanks for helping putting all this together. Stay tuned for future Catalyst Talks and keep engaging on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. I'm Joseph Kopser. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Joseph.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nora.